The French presidential campaign has come to its conclusion. After an intense two-week battle following the first round, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen now face the second round runoff of the French presidential election. They've been campaigning up and down the country, from here in Paris to small towns in the French countryside, debating purchasing power and the wider economy, the environment and the war in Ukraine. Whatever happens on Sunday, it will be historic. If Emmanuel Macron wins, he'll become the first French president in 20 years to be re-elected. If Marine Le Pen wins, well, she'll become the first female president in French history. Ross Cullen for SABC News, Paris.
Let's talk a little bit more about this. We are joined now by Professor Vivian A. Schmidt. She is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration in the Paris School of Global Affairs at the Boston University in the USA. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, at least South African time. Let's just first start with where things stand at the moment. As I said, for the first time, Marine Le Pen's Right Party has a win, or the closest that they've been. And compared to 2017, Emmanuel Macron obviously had a far higher margin. Why are we seeing the change now?
Thank you so much for having me, and delighted to be there in South African time. Basically, the problem is that lots of people on the left and the right don't like Macron. They didn't like his policies. He's had major crises on a regular basis. And of course, it's a lot to do with people feeling that he's arrogant, and having difficulty, it's the ordinary people, difficulty making ends meet, and they blame him. In fact, his policies have not been nearly as bad as the French perceive them. During the COVID pandemic, in fact, he was incredibly active in ensuring that jobs were maintained, businesses, et cetera. And he spent tremendous amounts of money for that. But it doesn't seem to matter as much, or let's put it this way. He is, one assumes that he will win at a margin of about 56% to her 44% or such, but no one never knows. Accidents happen. And she has been very successful in terms of making arguments about purchasing power and playing down for a long time the anti-immigrant rhetoric that she had been using prior, so that by switching to purchasing power rather than anti-immigrant, mainly anti-Muslim, she was able to seem much more normal to people. It's quite extraordinary how many people see her as normal. Over 50, possibly even 60% now see her as a normal candidate. So not like 2017 when she was seen as very extreme right, even though her policy recommendations haven't changed at all.
And I want to talk about that perception or the understanding of being far right. We've seen Europe become a more nationalistic, move more far right, and the choices of governments that it's made. Has that in a way kind of dumbed down what some people would have been repelled by? And I believe that the left and what their choices are in this election is far more important in whether or not Macron will hang on to his role at the head or at the helm of France. Can you just share your thoughts on these two issues?
Yes. So in terms of the left, there's a lot of disappointment in terms of Mélenchon, the left candidate, not winning. He got 22%. Which is actually very high, and had the left been united, he would have been the winning candidate. You've got a division in France where it's almost one third, one third, one third. with, I guess, or let's say it's in the 20s and 20s with the mainstream parties really collapsing. But in any case, the left is unhappy because of the economic policies, in particular in the first years of Macron's presidency. He cut job security. He was trying to reform the pension system, didn't succeed, but now has promised in his campaign to make retirement age at 65 from between 60 and 62. So these are all factors that the left was unhappy with. But more than that, I think there was a feeling that he was not in touch with the people, that Macron was arrogant. It comes back over and over again. So the big question now is, how will the left vote? Will some go to Marine Le Pen? Will some go to Macron? And will the largest number simply abstain or vote what they call blanc, sort of a white vote, meaning they will vote, but they will not choose. And this is really this is a protest against the lack of choice that they have. You have lots of people on the left who feel that they have had to vote over and over again for center-right candidates. And although Macron ran as neither on the left nor the right in 2017, his policies are much more center-right than they are on the left. So the left feels that yet again they would have to vote against, basically for two candidates of whom they disapprove.
Is it a trend that you're seeing more and more, that splitting of the vote? And is it more an act of desperation? I'm thinking particularly of the television debate, how people would have responded to some of those tough questions, or what would have moved them or swayed them from what would have been seen as their traditional positions, these two contenders. Have you seen evidence of that? And I know a lot of that has been spurred on by COVID-19 and how Macron himself has handled that, and his lack of campaigning during the Ukraine-Russia war, because he spent so much time playing mediator. Has that influenced the lackluster, if it were to be described as that, support that he's received?
Yeah, there's no question that actually when he first focused on the Ukraine crisis, he got a bounce in the polls. But as he continued not to engage with the debates, with the other candidates who were themselves debating one another, people got frustrated. It's also the case that because of the Ukraine crisis, much of the attention was on that rather than on the campaigns. Nonetheless, during the debate itself, Macron, I think 59% of viewers felt that Macron won, as opposed to something like 39 or 30 plus for Le Pen. But the point is that actually there were only, I think, 15.6 million viewers of this, which is about the lowest level of viewership since 1974. So that even though Macron won in that debate, not that many people saw it. I think there's a kind of the biggest vote is for abstention, although in the first round it was predicted that the level of abstention would be much higher than it actually was. It was at 26%, and lots of people are predicting that it will be at least that, if not a couple points higher. I suppose in the debate it's important to note the issues, and that is that Marine Le Pen did not seem credible on the economics. But for people who have difficulty making ends meet to the end of the month, people who want to vote for her anyway, that was not a problem. And during the debate, she seemed possibly presidential not at the level of Macron, but she was calm, she was collected, she was cool, unlike the 2017 debate, so that she did not disgrace herself. And I think for lots of people who are angry, they would say, well, let's just vote for her, or rather, we're not going to vote at all. But there's a real danger there, because the kind of policies she proposes violate human rights, violate in particular the rights of ethnic minorities. She wants to forbid wearing the headscarf in public. She wants a referendum on identity and nation to give priority to French nationals for all sorts of services. And this goes against the EU, the European Union treaties, where she wants to treat as strangers even European Union citizens, to give them less access to jobs, to social services, social assistance, and even healthcare. And if this goes against the constitutional guarantees of the Fourth and the Fifth Republic, but she basically says she's going to hold a referendum, and that therefore the kind of checks and balances of the liberal institutions like the judiciary would not be able to stop her.
And no doubt Europe is watching with keen interest the outcome of these elections. And there's some who say it's not inconceivable if she wins the election. But I want to talk about international policy and how that might change. You mentioned the changes that she would probably propose to make on domestic policy. What can be expected in terms of international policy change, and how Europe, or what outcome Europe would possibly prefer given the current circumstances, the challenges that it faces now?
Disaster for Europe, in particular because France in Europe has always been kind of the political leader. And when it has a president who doesn't lead, it doesn't go very far. And Macron, since 2017, actually had a major vision for the EU. And when COVID hit, he helped move it forward, in particular by convincing the Germans to have EU-level debt for the first time, which broke taboos against sharing of debt. All sorts of very positive things occurred as a result of Macron's being president of France. Were Marine Le Pen to become president of France, she wants a different Europe. She calls it a Europe of nations. So what you'd have is no shared EU-level debt, for common causes. So if you think about the Ukraine crisis, there's a need for more energy security, for more money spent on defense, and it needs to be done at the EU level. That would not happen. She would put up border controls to ensure against foreigners, and also to check the goods. So it would violate not only the Schengen rules for basically free and open borders, but also freedom of movement of citizens and freedom of movement of goods. So all of that, and you could also, on top of that, forget any ambitions for common security and defense. She's got, if we look more globally, her closeness to Putin, the fact that she's got major loans from Russian banks and also Hungarian banks, means that you'd have a real problem in terms of leadership in Europe on the security end as well. She's already pledged to withdraw from NATO, from NATO's integrated command, so that in effect, if Marine Le Pen were elected president, Europe would not move forward, because Europe moves with France as and a French president who is a positive force within Europe. She would be a negative force within Europe. She would more likely join what's often called the sovereignty coalition with the Poles and the Hungarians in particular. to push this Europe of nations. Anyway, highly problematic in all ways.
And what would...
And for Europe.
Okay,
Sorry.
go ahead. You can complete your sentence.
No, I just think for Europe, at best, it would be good gridlock. At worst, you might end up with the disintegration of Europe or the creation of a different Europe without France.
It was interesting to hear your thoughts on what it would do for Europe, as in it might weaken what Europe has been saying, coalescing around the issue of Russia, Ukraine. As you know, Africa has been divided in terms of the posture that the continent ought to take at the United Nations on this issue. So, Marine Le Pen, what would that do for Africa? You mentioned immigration issues. What would that do for Africa if Marine Le Pen had to win?
It would be a total disaster for Africa in many, many ways. The European Union has been very forthcoming in terms of trying to have private aid. It's not been that great on immigration from Africa, that's for sure, in terms of having Libya take back refugees or migrants or economic migrants. But whatever one's complaints about EU policy as it is now, with Marine Le Pen, it would be a nightmare. I was listening to a debate between the current Minister of the Interior and Jordan Bardella, who is the main spokesman for the party and the interim party head, and he essentially said that they would any migrants from Africa or anywhere, actually, they would simply put on planes and send back. And when Macron's Minister of the Interior, who is pretty hard-nosed on migration in any case, asked him, what would that mean? Would you send someone back to Afghanistan? A woman or a homosexual or whatever? Bardella paused and then she said, well, we'd work with the United Nations and we'd set up camps right on the borders of these countries if we can't send them back straight into the countries. So clearly they haven't thought it through. They don't really care about the human rights issues. And for Africa, I think on the migration issue, it would be terrible. Among other things, although she doesn't use the term, as Eric Zemmour, the man to the extreme right of her, said, the great replacement, she has essentially referred to that and would try to, essentially, I think, said that in this referendum, they would essentially say that they would send back as many migrants and refugees, and actually people living in France today.
That's fascinating, Professor Schmidt, because we know that a lot of Francophone Africans who actually see France as their home, who've made sure that they've built a life in France around the French culture. And that is something that has also caused a lot of fissures around the accountability that France bears, especially over not only colonial baggage for Africa and its inability to develop, but even issues around reparations now, where Francophone African are still paying taxes to France. So how would that discussion go? Would it worsen? I mean, Emmanuel Macron did not apologize, but he acknowledged the injustices on Francophonie Africa and France's role of that. So Marine Le Pen would say that she would be completely disinterested. Completely. Essentially, I think she sees, as her father did, that
France was not to blame for its colonial history. This is what you'd see as a rewriting of history, suggesting that everything that the French did was fine in terms of colonialism, or at least it wasn't nearly as bad as it was. Interestingly, she wants to change the citizenship laws so that even a child, and we're talking about North Africans, primarily Algerians, I would think, that even a child born in France from parents born in France would not necessarily get citizenship. So it's really seeking to limit citizenship and presumably deport any number of people for whatever reason could be found.
Thank you so much for your time and insights. Really appreciate it. Professor Vivienne A. Schmidt, she is the Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration in the Pardee School of Global Affairs at Boston University in the United States of America.